We are going live. Let me just double check that it is showing up where it should be, and then we will jump in. This is going to be a live recording of my new podcast, Evolve with Dr. Tay, Real Conversations for Autism Parents. All right, I see it live there. Let me just check one other place, and then we are going to jump in. Okay. All right. So, as I mentioned, this is a live recording of my podcast. And this is episode 2, and we're going to be focusing on regulating your emotions and supporting your child's emotional development. There will be a Q&A at the end in my Facebook group, my Facebook community for autism parents, also called Evolve. So come join us at facebook.com/groups/evolve. And then if you are seeing this live on any public platform like my personal Facebook page or YouTube, please share it. If you are not a autism parent yourself, but you know someone who could benefit from this, I would be so greatly appreciative. Or you can also tag them in this recording. All right, so we are going to jump in. I will not be responding to any comments or questions until the end, just so that you know that. All right, we're going to dive in. Have you ever noticed that when your child is emotionally dysregulated, you have less patience or you feel more on edge? This may be especially true if your child is frequently dysregulated. You have a certain capacity for emotion regulation yourself, and you may be reaching your capacity each day. And as you become more dysregulated, so does your child. The solution, though, is not to just shut off your emotions and weather the storm, but then the question becomes, what do you do to regulate yourself and in turn help support your child? So in this episode, we are going to discuss co-regulation and how children learn effective emotion regulation. We're also going to dive into the reasons there is more emotion dysregulation in autism. And then at the end of the episode, I am going to give you 5 tips for effective emotion regulation. I'm Dr. Tay, a licensed child psychologist and parental mindset coach specializing in autism. I have supported hundreds of autistic children and their families and have been in the autism field for over a decade. I'm the host of Evolve, the podcast where we have real conversations that are designed for autism parents just like you. Each week, we will discuss topics that directly impact your life, from providing psychoeducation about autism and neurodiversity to talking about your personal growth, well-being, and evolution as a parent. We dive into it all. Just keep in mind, nothing shared on this podcast is clinical advice, and you should consult with a medical or mental health provider if you need support. Now, let's get to talking about emotion regulations. Now, listen, I could talk about this topic for hours. This actually was one of my areas of expertise when I was doing research. So if you were to go do a scholarly search on something like Google Scholar, you will see I have published lots on this research topic. And so in this episode, though, I'm going to talk a little bit about the research, but I'm going to make it digestible for you as a parent. I do want to keep this episode short, though, so I'm going to just give you some key points. But here's the great news. I am hosting a masterclass to dive into this topic further. So if you are wanting more info, and on this topic, there is info in my show notes on how to sign up. Quick aside, if you're listening to the live recording of this and you want more info on the masterclass, just comment masterclass below and I will send it to you. All right, so we are going to talk about you. If you noticed in the intro, I talked about you as part of this. And a lot of times I have people come to me and be like, I need help supporting my autistic child with their emotion regulation. And so this episode isn't just focused on your child. Of course, we're going to talk about your child and how you can support them because I know that is your primary goal. But I also want you to notice that we are talking about you in this. And the reason for that is what we see traditional approaches focus on teaching your autistic child emotion regulation strategies. And those are great. And we know those work from research. But one of the areas of challenge that I find with working with families is that for the majority of autistic children, and this is actually true of neurotypical children as well, but in particular, autistic children, is they need support with practicing and implementing it. And so if you're asking them to practice and implement it, you need to be familiar with these approaches yourself. And this also requires you to be emotionally regulated. So, this whole process where you are supporting them in emotionally regulating is called co regulation. And this co regulation is one of the things that helps develop self regulation. So, this is true both in and outside of the autism field, is that co regulation precedes self-regulation, meaning it comes before. This is how even neurotypical children learn to emotionally regulate themselves. And so this means that in the process of your child learning emotion regulation, we actually do want to be providing a lot of support. That is beneficial, and we know that from research. And one of the reasons that they need this co-regulation is this isn't, meaning emotion regulation isn't an innate skill that kids are born with. It is something that has to be taught. It's something that is developed over time. And like I said, this is true for even neurotypical children. Now, with neurotypical children, they just naturally tend to learn more readily from their environment. So if you have neurotypical children, you might be like, well, I didn't have to teach them how to emotionally regulate. They just figured it out. With autistic children, we absolutely know they can learn. And this is true outside of even emotion regulation. It's true across the board, is that autistic children can learn skills. One of the things though, is sometimes it just takes more trials and more repetition of practicing in order for those skills to become independent. So with that being said, what we know about research, one of the, research studies have shown, and then we also see this in real life, in real time, that children tend to seek out their parents when they need comfort, particularly young children. And we know that this process is sometimes disrupted in autism. Even from a young age, we see differences in how autistic children and neurotypical children regulate themselves. And this was an area, this is what I focused on for my dissertation study in order to earn my PhD. And my dissertation study found that autistic children had more frustration and less joy in toddlerhood. So all the kids in my study were 22 to 28 months of age. So right around that 2-year age mark. And we were already seeing significant differences. What's interesting about the autistic children that participated in my study is they attempted to regulate, but they were doing so less effectively. And it's interesting because other studies have found similar patterns. So this wasn't just unique to the sample of children that I had in my study. So from a young age, autistic children, and even those with elevated likelihood, which just a lot of times how we study that is we look at the younger siblings of autistic children. What we know is that they tend to be more reactive. So that's just like a helpful kind of background, is that, at baseline, your autistic child just might be naturally more reactive. And we're going to talk about why shortly. So another reason that we're talking about you right now and co-regulation as well is that modeling is one of the most effective ways for children to learn. Again, true across the board. This isn't specific to emotion regulation, but when you model something, that helps children to really be able to notice it. So if you, for example, are screaming at your child, which, listen, I got to say this caveat real quick, is anything I say here is not to shame you about your emotions. It's to help you gain awareness. And one of the keys for change, for growth, is you actually have to be aware that it's happening first. And listen, all of your emotions are valid, but one of the things that we're talking about right now is how can you use your emotions? How can you leverage your emotions to help your child have more effective emotional processing? So this happens. It's totally, every parent does it at some point. But I just want you to kind of like take a step back, and like listen to this example. So if you are screaming at your child to take deep breaths, maybe your child's having, some sort of meltdown, or is really distressed about something or feeling anxious. So you're screaming at them, or even just saying firmly, I need you to take a deep breath, right? You're escalated in that moment. You're being a little bit more reactive than your baseline. And if you're saying that, with this sense of kind of annoyance or urgency, they feel that energy. Right. And so it's actually going to make it less likely that they take deep breaths. This is kind of one of the misconceptions that I hear a lot, is that parents are taught that like taking deep breaths is really, really effective for emotion regulation. But then I have parents come to me and be like, oh, Taylor, we have tried that. It doesn't work. And usually with some fine tuning, we can get it to work. And some of that, though, is you learning the breathing process yourself, you actually modeling it. And instead of commanding your child to do it, you are saying, let's do this together. Or it might even be, depending on how your child reacts, it might be, I'm going to take a deep breath. And as you dive into that and you really slow down that process, what we see is that children start to, imitate that. Now, if your child doesn't have imitation yet, which is a skill, again, that a lot of times has to be taught in autism, there are other ways that you can do it. But even if they don't imitate, it still has this calming presence. And so we're going to dive more into this, but again, the most effective way to get them to engage in deep breathing, for example, is for you to model it. All right. So that kind of talks about why are we talking about you, and how children are learning emotion regulation through co-regulation first. So seeing you do it, and you actually being emotionally regulated yourself in order to most optimally support them and help them practice the skills repeatedly. So let's talk about now why, we see higher rates of emotion dysregulation in autism, which we do across the board. Taking a step back, though, is understanding what emotion regulation is, right? I'm throwing out these terms. What does it actually mean? Emotion regulation underlies a lot of mental health disorders. So things like anxiety, depression, eating disorders, trauma. Probably most diagnoses that you find in what's called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is our gold standard, tool for diagnosing mental health disorders. The majority, I should say, of those have some component where emotion regulation is coming into play. Now, it's important to keep in mind that we're not saying, and research doesn't say, that emotion regulation causes these disorders, or we're not saying that emotion dysregulation causes these disorders, but rather that it is a maintaining factor, meaning it contributes to the presentation and it kind of perpetuates the cycle. So there are a lot of definitions of emotion regulation. If you dive into the research literature, you can find a million definitions. I want to keep it really simple for you. I'm also going to use the definition and share the definition that I used in my research all the time. And so it's really thinking about emotion regulation in two parts. We have the reactivity, that initial reaction, what happens in that moment. And then we also, as part of emotion regulation, have the ability to either upregulate or downregulate. And so it can go both ways. So I'll give you an example. Anxiety. We see that it has high reactivity, meaning you react really quickly, things escalate quickly. And then on top of that, often there's this difficulty down-regulating to a calm state. So we have reactivity. It either can be quote unquote, I say quote unquote because I don't want to pathologize this in any way or make it sound bad, but for definition purposes is that we have too much of an emotion or too little of an emotion. And too little is often like with joy, like not having enough. Now, we don't conceptualize it when we're talking about emotions. All emotions are valid. It's super important for you to recognize that. But in terms of terminology definitions, it's either too much reactivity or too little reactivity. And then you're trying to upregulate, bring your reactivity up, or downregulate, bring your reactivity down. All right, so now that you understand what emotion regulation is, let's I think that's going to help your understanding of just like broadly of this topic and also the reasons that we see elevated rates in autism. So, first and foremost, are genetic differences. Genetics highly underlie autism as it is, and there is some support that genetic differences also underlie emotion dysregulation. So I mentioned this earlier, but we have key differences early on. So I want you to think about your child as a baby. Would you consider them, to have more of an easygoing disposition? Or would you say they were difficult to soothe? So take a moment right now and actually think about your autistic child or your child that you have concerns about, right? Or honestly, any of your children. And what if you have multiple children, you might notice too that they had, differences in how they were even from a super, super young age. And these differences are what is called temperament. And every kid has a temperament. And we know that temperament is influenced by genetics. And then temperament also informs the development of later personality, and it informs processes which contribute to emotional functioning. So again, easygoing versus difficult to soothe, there's some emotional components that come into it. So genetics is one of those reasons we see higher rates of emotion dysregulation in autism. The next one is executive functioning deficit. So not only are these associated with autism, executive functioning deficits, meaning we also see them associated with ADHD, which ADHD is often, co-occurring with autism. We see quite a high rate of overlap where kids have autism and ADHD. And so executive functioning deficits, we see them with both autism and ADHD, and it includes things like cognitive flexibility, working memory, planning, task initiation. I could go on and on. So let me give you an example though of how executive functioning deficits, may be underlying these difficulties with emotion difficulties with emotion regulation in autistic children. So, for example, I want to talk about what classically we call as rigid thinking patterns. This is kind of more of a medical term, but it helps you kind of conceptualize of like getting stuck on thinking about something or thinking about something in in the same way. And rigidity is actually a core symptom of autism. Now, not all autistic children have rigidity, but it is one of those core symptoms that could be part of your child's presentation. So say your autistic child makes a request and for whatever reason, you're unable to honor that. Like maybe they want to go to the park and it's snowing outside and, you can't, or it could be anything, right? But say you actually are not able to honor it. They may then have difficulty shifting away from that request, right? So you might see what we call, again, a medical term, perseveration, where they're kind of getting stuck in their thoughts. They're asking over and over. And the more that you say no, the more that starts to, make them escalate because it's frustrating to them. They're not understanding why. Another thing is maybe you honor the request, but it's not in the exact way they wanted, and that is distressing to them. So, there's all of these ways, and not being able to shift the thought pattern, which is a core feature of executive functioning, is causing this distress, is causing this emotion dysregulation. Another example of this is also they may forget what you ask them to do. So working memory is the ability to hold multiple things in your brain. So maybe you ask them to put their toys away, go downstairs, put their shoes on and their coat on, right? And they put their toys away and then they forget what they're doing. They get distracted. They start playing again. And here's the thing is with executive functioning deficits, they might actually not be able to hold all of that information in their brain. They may want to listen to you and even be attempting to listen to what you requested, but things are dropping out. And listen, this occurs across the board. We all have a working memory kind of cap of like how much we can hold in our brain. And so then what happens is, you come in, you're like, why Are you not doing what I told you to do? And they become upset because they wanted to do a good job, but it simply dropped out. And then as they become more upset, you react more and more to that and how they didn't follow directions. And so it causes this like big blow up. And so again, I want to caveat here. I share this not to shame you of like, you shouldn't be telling your child, why didn't you follow directions? I hope that this gives you some insight of where some of this emotion dysregulation may be coming from, but this is to help you learn. And I want you to keep in mind, I hear this a lot from, parents, especially I would say before parents start, therapy and really learning about autism is, well, I think they're intentionally not listening to me. They want to disobey me. I'll hear things like, they look right at me and they do the opposite. And more often than not, yes, autistic children can have, co-occurring opposition or defiance as part of it. But I would say more often than not, your child may not be doing it intentionally, and they may not be trying to ignore you. It could be an executive functioning deficit. And so understanding that might help to reduce kind of that escalating response to the situation. Okay, a third consideration is receptive language. So this is the ability to actually understand language. The example I just talked about was talking about maybe they understood everything you said, but things were dropping out of their memory. The other thing is you should consider, do they actually understand everything you're trying to tell them to do or you're trying to explain? And so you might be having a situation and you're explaining why it's a no, but they actually might not be able to understand it. One, because if they have receptive language, that isn't matching the level of where you're speaking, that for sure is contributing. But also as children get more dysregulated, particularly autistic children, but this is true across the board. And even as adults, this is true. As we get more dysregulated, it's harder to take information in. It's like information overwhelm. So you might be describing and explaining to them why it's a no, but they might not be fully comprehending it. Also, keep in mind, expressive language is another piece. Like they may be feeling really misunderstood. Maybe they're trying to explain something and the way that they're explaining it isn't making sense to you. And so then you're having this miscommunication, and miscommunication often causes, this escalation and dysregulation. Other things that might be popping up and other kind of underlying reasons we see more dysregulation in autistic children is autistic children might have difficulty with the feelings that arise. So when you have an intense emotional reaction, those feelings can be distressing themselves, and they might be even more distressing for your autistic child. That as soon as they feel those intense emotions come on, all of their skills go out the window, right? Or they just, maybe they don't even have the skills to be able to deal with them. So every time that these distressing feelings come up, it's like automatic shutdown mode. The last piece, and this is somewhat related to what I was just saying, is sensory overstimulation. The world can be a much more hectic place for autistics, right? Maybe, you might hear a slight humming, but to them, it's incredibly distracting or loud or even painful. Or the overhead lights, particularly like fluorescent lights that are in like classrooms or malls, things like that. They may feel so harsh to your autistic child. Other things is maybe they're overheating too, like they don't have body regulation. And this sensory overstimulation is going to contribute to more emotional dysregulation. Think about when you're sick, for example, right? Immediately your capacity is way less. And so not that they're like have a virus or anything. Although if your child does have a virus, I hear this time and time again, I will be honest, in my clinical practice, it has been a couple weeks of, Taylor, it feels like everything is going in the opposite direction. Like we're having a lot more, challenges, things like that, right? There are so many viruses going around right now. Also, the time of year and shifting of routines, all of that, right, are contributing. But anyway, I digress in this point. So I just wanted to give you an analogy of when you feel bad, how your capacity is limited. And so sensory overstimulation may be limiting their capacity for emotion regulation. Okay, so I know that was a lot, but I think it's really important to understand this phenomena before we jump into tips, right? Because I can give you tips all day, but if you don't really fully understand their application and why we're doing the things we're doing, it's going to be so much harder for you to implement. And one of the things I want to say right off the bat is with, you know, emotion regulation and being able to regulate as a family, it is going to take consistency. Nothing that I share here is going to be a quick fix. And so this is one of the things too, I talked about deep breathing earlier and parents being like, it's not working. And some of it is the approach, but I also often find, and it's hard to change. It's hard to implement new things, but that maybe the skill hasn't been done enough. It hasn't had enough trials. It hasn't been repeated enough. And one of the things that I'm going to encourage you to do is to actually practice these skills even when your child isn't dysregulated. It's going to be easier for them to learn these skills in a more regulated state than it is going to be a dysregulated state. This is also true for you. When you are dysregulated yourself, you're overwhelmed, you're not going to learn as effectively. You're not going to be able to implement as effectively either. And so this is where getting those trials when the whole family is, more calm can be so critical. Okay, so let's talk about what some of these are. So we talked about this one, but the first tip is to model what you want and to disengage from the argument. One of the things that tends to happen for children, that have high verbal abilities is they tend to explain everything, right? And then you're trying to explain everything. And I like to say it's like an analogy of pushing, right? If you think about two people pushing each other, one person pushes, the other person pushes back, what starts to happen is you have a fight. It goes back and forth. And this is verbally what can happen when individuals are dysregulated. But if you actually can disengage from the argument and instead model what you want, this can be really effective. And I want you to, again, think of this pushing analogy. This might be like someone pushing you and you just taking a step back. Soon, not that any of this is fun, but it doesn't become fun, right? To fight with someone who isn't reacting back. And so I want you to kind of think of that visual in your head when you're trying to disengage from the argument. So actually modeling what you want. What do you want them to do instead? Can you show them? Can you, tell them calmly, right? Calm voice might also be one of the things that you're modeling. Maybe you're showing them deep breathing as well. Okay, maybe you're saying, you as the parent are saying this, I am really, I'm a 10 out of 10 right now. I'm going to take some deep breaths, and you just sit there and you breathe and you really slow down that process. Yes, maybe even while your kid is like yelling. It is so hard to do. I do not want to, make this sound like, again, it's not a quick fix. It's going to take time, but I will tell you, these are evidence-based strategies that we know actually work. And I'm going to touch on this at the end, but if you need support in this, there are plenty of ways, you can work with the therapist to actually help you navigate this, because I know it's challenging. So that was the first tip. Model what you want and disengage from the argument. Tip number two is get on their level. Literally get down eye to eye with them. So why this is effective is, one, it's going to be easier for your child to communicate with you in this way, particularly autistic children that have difficulty communicating, by definition of their autism. So getting on their level is making it easier for them to communicate with you. It also shows more of a collaborative effort, that you guys are in it together. It's not you versus them. You are a team going at this. I think it just helps to kind of automatically bring down the tension levels. You're not, in this position where you're towering over them. Maybe you have a loud voice because you're frustrated. Again, understandable, but that isn't ultimately getting you to your desired outcome. So get on their level. And then related to this, I want you to keep your language really simple. Try not to over explain things. Try to give short sentences. Let them know what you want them to do instead of saying, I don't want you to do this. Tell them what you do want them to do and keep it simple. Tip number 3 is actually pausing before you interact. Obviously, being reactive, it's super easy just to jump into I got to explain this to you, or problem solving mode. But by taking a pause and collecting yourself, you are going to be so much more clear-minded when you are interacting with your child and also trying to support your child. And so this pause for you, it could be just like you're still in the moment, but you're taking a few breaths. You don't even need to announce you're doing that. If you need to collect yourself before you help them regulate, then do that. Sometimes though, especially, for older children or children that have more verbal abilities, you might say something like, we will discuss this shortly. I need to take a break right now. Not only you're modeling, right, that taking a break is really healthy, it's really effective, but then that gives you the opportunity to collect yourself and be able to go into this more regulated. Number 4 is to normalize feelings and talk about them, validate them in this process. So if you noticed, as I was talking, I stopped multiple times and talked about how emotions and feelings are valid and that we don't want to make them a bad thing, right? Feeling anger is not bad. It is human. As humans, all of us, like, feeling all of these emotions is unique to the human experience. We do not want to take those away. We do not want to mute them. Instead, what we're trying to do, though, is shift a little bit in how that anger is coming out and how we handle that anger. So one of the things, again, going back to the language, it could be something like, I understand you're really angry right now. I need you to keep your hands to yourself, because they're like hitting a sibling, something like that. Or you could even say, it is not okay to hit. I know you're really angry and it is not okay to hit. I'm going to help us all stay safe right now. Let's do a big bear squeeze. And again, this might be something, not even something you need to. I'm going to recommend you practice this ahead of time so that your child isn't like, what is going on, right? But sometimes autistic children love that physical input. You got to figure out, though, if that's right for your child. So normalizing feelings and talking about them both in the moment, but I also want you to talk about feelings outside of these intense moments. So as you're going through your day, again, modeling, you might say, I feel sad right now, right? Think about what's developmentally appropriate for your child, but I will say actually naming your emotions, talking about them, letting your child know it is okay to have them is really a helpful process. And some of the ways that we normalize feelings is them actually seeing you have feelings and reactions. Again, the feelings themselves are not bad. It's what we do with those feelings. This might be, I don't know, controversial, maybe isn't quite the right word, but a little bit of pressing of buttons is, I truly believe it is okay to cry in front of your child. You don't have to be this strong person that always holds it together. And that goes for 2 reasons. One, it teaches them it's okay to cry, right? And we want to make sure we are allowing them to cry. Crying is so incredibly healthy. And the second reason is then you're not suppressing it, right? Because a lot of times you can't leave that moment and the tears are coming up and you just say, suck it up and hold it in, right? That is emotional suppression, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But I really believe it is okay to cry in front of your child. I always say, again, keep it developmentally appropriate. For example, if you have a family member pass away or a close friend pass away, that is so normal for your child to see you cry. Now, with your preschooler, you might not go into exactly how the person died and everything that you're experiencing and all the overwhelming emotions. That's what I mean by keeping it developmentally appropriate, but actually having conversations around these things helps to normalize them. Okay. So pretty much the first 4 focused on your child and what you can do to support your child, right? Model what you want and disengage from the argument, number 1. Number 2 is getting on their level and using simple language, so it helps with communication. Number 3 is pause before you interact. Number 4 is normalize feelings and talk about them and actually validate that emotions are healthy and normal and part of the human experience. Number 5, is all about you because, and I think this is one of the most highly underrated things. And this is something that if you work with child therapists, I'll be honest, they don't often talk about because they're really focused on your child. And this is where, I have shifted my approach as a psychologist to include the whole family approach, which I developed because I really see, as we talked about the interaction of child and parent here, I see the value and I know how important it is for you as a parent to be in a healthy place and for you to feel supported. So this is something I have no problem talking about, in session with parents, but having time for you to feel your feelings separate from your child, right? I talked about it's okay for them to see some of your feelings, but I want you to create a space where you are actually allowed to feel. You are giving yourself permission to feel. Having this feeling time, maybe it's a little bit you set aside each day where you're just letting it out and you're letting it flow. Because here's the reason this is important. One of the most common things I see with emotional suppression, or one of the most common things I see is emotional suppression from parents, particularly autistic parents. Sorry, particularly parents of autistic children. Okay. So you learned it as a kid, most likely, because way back when we grew up, we weren't as emotion aware as we are now. And it was just embedded into our culture, saying things like, oh, you're fine, stop crying. Or I even remember, and maybe you've heard me say this before if you've been following me like on social media accounts for a while, but I will never forget the phrase, sticks and stones may break our bones, but words will never hurt me. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's literally teaching emotional suppression, y'all. It's saying that if someone says something mean to you, that you're not allowed to have a feeling or an emotion over it. Or another one is like, don't worry, be happy. Like, okay, it is okay to worry. It is okay to have negative emotions. So it was more embedded in our culture and it was more accepted to practice emotional suppression. And so but now, fast forward, what we're seeing is that our generation and even younger generations are starting to need more support and therapy. And there is this relationship between how we're processing emotions and things like anxiety and depression and all of that. So we learned it when we were young, which means unlearning it, right? The other thing though, is it often is reinforced because it feels really adaptive. That like get shit done motto of like, suck it up, let's keep going. And you're so productive, right? Sometimes we don't view feeling our emotions as productive. But here's the thing I want to tell you is feelings don't disappear. They're going to be in there somewhere and they're going to come out somehow. And so this is one of my favorite examples because I shouldn't say I know every parent has had this example, but probably you can relate to this, is your child has a glass of milk and accidentally knocks it over. And then all of a sudden you find yourself like screaming over a glass of spilled milk. And it's like later you're like, why did I yell like that? Like it really wasn't that big of a deal. More likely than not, it's because you've been suppressing all these other emotions and it just got channeled to the wrong thing, right? It gets channeled to a glass of milk. And then your child is being like, I'm sorry, like that was an accident, right? And so this is why it's so healthy to actually take time and process our emotions. The other thing is your child might be sensing your tension as you're trying to suppress things. Again, these emotions don't disappear and they might be picking up on your tension. So I think that providing time for you to actually process is one of the most highly underrated skills. And dealing with your own emotion, you know what? First off, you deserve that, right? You deserve to be able to experience your emotions in a healthy way. But secondly, if you want to see a change in your child's emotions, it takes work and it will take you being regulated. So that change, and I say this lovingly, the change that you so desperately want your child to make, it starts with you. And so this is exactly something that I'm going to be diving more into in my masterclass. Like I said, if you are, listening right now and you're interested in the masterclass, I have linked all the information in the show notes. And as an aside, if you're watching live right now, you can just comment masterclass and I will send you the information. The last point I want to make before I wrap up this episode is to don't be afraid to seek help, right? You can work with a child therapist on everything that I described, for example. Also, and I find that super, super effective. That's something that I work with parents a lot on and families a lot on, is this effective emotion regulation process. I also want to mention that sometimes medication can be an answer too. Of course, let's insert all clinical disclaimers here. I'm not saying or making any clinical recommendations, but I want to just give you some knowledge real quick on medications. I also want to caveat that I am not a provider that can prescribe medications. And so my knowledge of medications is based on reading it in the literature and talking to other providers, but I think it's helpful to know. So I always say we really want to make sure we're supporting kids' skill development, and that's what therapy is for. But sometimes medications can be adjunctive and are necessary for some kids. Like an example of this is if your child is engaging in a lot of self-injurious behavior, it could be because of emotion dysregulation and irritability. And so there are actually currently 2 medications that are FDA approved for autistic children. It's Abilify and Risperidol to target irritability in particular. And irritability and emotion dysregulation tend to be synonymous. Now, keeping in mind, again, not recommending this, you absolutely need to talk to your medical team about this because there are a lot of side effects with these medications. They are antipsychotics, but we also know that for some kids, being able to have control of themselves is really, really important. And then I've also seen, and this is anecdotal, but I've also seen, autistic children have a lot of success with SSRIs, which is like an antidepressant. It also works on anxiety because if we can kind of take off that edge, as well as stimulant medications for ADHD can impact emotion, regulation, because like we talked about is, some of these like core deficits associated with ADHD could be impacting the emotion dysregulation. And then the last piece is I want you to consider, if you need the support, working with a therapist or a coach yourself. Like I mentioned, you're likely going to have to unlearn some patterns that you learned, and you've been doing for many, many years. And that's hard work. And listen, you will feel better by learning effective emotional processing. I'm going to tell you, outcomes of this are more joy, less anxiety and overwhelm, more effective communication, less outbursts. Like imagine a world where you were experiencing this. But I know what's most important to you is how it impacts your child. And I hope through this episode, you saw that you effectively emotionally regulating yourself is going to have a dramatic input. It's going to have a dramatic effect on your autistic child and even your non-autistic children as well. And maybe, not even maybe, likely your relationship. So it really has this effect on the whole family system when you pour into you, when you focus on yourself. And I don't mean this in that like cliche, oh my gosh, I can't say that. I don't mean this in this cliche way of like, pour into yourself first before you pour into others. Like this is like real, right? By literally focusing on yourself, it is going to have a dramatic impact on your family. So to summarize, in this episode, we talked about co-regulation and how children learn effective emotion regulation. We also talked about the reasons that we see higher rates of emotion dysregulation in autism, as well as 5 tips for effective emotion regulation. We also started to touch on how emotional suppression may be impacting you, and it may be time to unlearn behaviors. If you want to dive more into this topic and learn real, take home application for effective emotion regulation, we're going to go even deeper in my masterclass. So be sure to check that out. All right, that is a wrap for this week's episode of Evolve with Dr. Tay. Thank you for listening. If you are listening on Facebook in the Evolve community, start dropping your questions about this week's topic, emotion dysregulation, both you as a parent as well as in your child, in the comments. And I'm going to do a live Q&A in that Facebook community, because each week following the live recording, I host a Q&A exclusively in my Facebook group. You can join this community too at facebook.com/groups/evolve autism. You get access to engage with me, plus you can connect with other like-minded autism parents. It is a community designed for you to feel seen, heard, and supported as a parent of an autistic child, and introduces you to my whole family approach. If you are listening anywhere else, I'm going to sign off now, and we'll see you live next week for another real conversation about all things autism in your family life. Okay, let's dive into the Q&A now. All right, give me a second. I am going to hop on and see if there are any questions. I know I am going live at a unusual time. I am not seeing any, although, I am also I hope this whole thing recorded, or that will be really unfortunate, because it's saying it's only been 17 minutes and I feel like it's been longer than 17 minutes. So, okay, no, on Instagram, it says that it's been 45. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. Let's see if I can disconnect.